Hello class, this is history for Monday, April 13, 2020. I hope that you can see my sign. It says World War II, Part 3, April 9th, 1942, June 6th, 1944. I'm going to try something a little different today. I'm going to try and show you pictures as I read. Let me know if it's too distracting or if you like it or if it's no good. All right, World War II. We left off in our study of this gargantuan war with the unprovoked attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. As you probably already know, this bombing led to an intense fighting in the Pacific Ocean between the United States and Japan. And that's where we'll start today. We'll look at early battles in the Pacific, the Battle of Stalingrad, which was the deadliest battle in World War II, and the Allied invasion of Normandy, better known as D-Day. Early battles in the Pacific. Just hours after attacking Pearl Harbor, the Japanese went on a bombing spree, seeking to destroy Western military bases scattered across islands of the Pacific. They hit Guam, Midway, and Wake Island, hoping to acquire vital resources. They also targeted the Philippines, which is a territory of the United States at that time, the city-state of Singapore, a colony of Great Britain, and Hong Kong, another British colony. The Japanese moved fast and furious. I'm going to try and show you a picture of a map here. You can see some of these places that I'm talking about. There we go. The Japanese moved fast and furious, and by April of 1942, they occupied nearly every island in the Pacific, as well as Burma, Thailand, and French Indochina, which is Vietnam. In fact, the Japanese Empire at its height went as far north as Manchuria, as far east as the Aleutian Islands, as far south as the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, and as far west as Burma. Let's just say that in no time at all, the Japanese swallowed up the Pacific. Why did the Japanese invade the Pacific right in the middle of World War II? Well, the answer is complicated, but here are a few reasons. As you remember, Japan grew prosperous when it opened its doors to the rest of the world in 1858. With that prosperity, Japan felt a great need for more resources and living space. Hindering Japan's ability to expand was the fact that Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States had colonies all over Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Japan resented that. The Japanese believed that their emperor was divine. Therefore, they would do anything for him. Soldiers were willing to die for their emperor, or were coerced to do so, as demonstrated by thousands of suicidal kamikazes. Emperor Hirohito believed his people were superior to other people, especially to other Asian peoples like Koreans and Chinese. As an example of Japanese aggression in 1937, the Japanese invaded the Chinese city of Nanking. This battle was an atrocious massacre. It demonstrated that Hirohito, much like Adolf Hitler, felt justified in expanding his empire by extremely ruthless means. As for the timing, it made perfect sense to the Japanese to invade European colonies in the middle of World War II because Europe was obviously distracted by war with the Nazis. As for attacking the United States at that time, Japan thought the Americans would cower after bombing of Pearl Harbor and not be a hindrance to their expansion. To them, the sooner the United States was out of the way, the better. They were wrong, however, about the U.S. reaction. As we mentioned in our last lesson, the United States declared war immediately. Between 1940 and 1947, approximately 11 million American men were inducted into military service, some voluntarily, some by the draft issued by President Roosevelt. Right after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese proudly and successfully muscled the United States out of the Philippines. After a 98-day struggle, General Douglas MacArthur, who oversaw the U.S. military in the Far East, was ordered by authorities to escape from the Philippines by torpedo boat. He left with the heartfelt promise that he would return to help American and Filipino troops left stranded on the Bataan Peninsula of the Philippines. Those troops put up a brave fight without MacArthur, but with little food to survive on and disease overwhelming them, they surrendered to the Japanese on April 9th, 1942. The 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers who laid down their arms were grossly mistreated. The Japanese, who were taught to fight to the death for their emperor, had no respect for the surrendered. Over a 6-day period, Japanese soldiers marched the half-starved troops without food and water to prison camps about 70 miles away. At least 10,000 died on the Bataan Death March. The tragic event has been named the Bataan Death March. Thousands who survived the march were tortured. From records of these atrocities, it would appear that the Japanese rivaled the Nazis in the ill treatment of their prisoners of war. Let's look at how the United States responded to the Japanese hostilities. 9 days after the Bataan surrender, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle sent 16 B-25 bombers over the city of Tokyo, Japan, targeting military and industrial centers. It was a clear message to the Japanese that the United States would employ all methods in the fight. The Doolittle raid, as it has been remembered, was particularly daring because these bombers carried enough fuel to reach Tokyo, but not enough to get back to the aircraft carrier that had launched them. And besides, the Army Air Corps B-25s were not configured to land aboard Navy aircraft carriers. Every pilot knew that he would likely crash land in Japanese-occupied China and face possible capture by the enemy. As the heroic story goes, every one of Doolittle's 16 planes crashed or was ditched after the bombing of Tokyo. Out of 80 airmen, 3 died in the mission and 4 died as prisoners of war in Japanese camps. 3 were executed and 1 died of disease in captivity. The bombs that were dropped over Tokyo killed 50 and injured 400. Doolittle at first believed his raid had failed. However, the story of it did so much to boost American morale and shake up the Japanese that Doolittle was awarded a Medal of Honor and promoted 2 ranks up. He went on to help the Allies in North Africa. Mixing fact with a little legend, Doolittle has been well honored by Americans through films of World War II. 1 month later, the United States deciphered a Japanese code alerting them to the fact that Japanese were planning on capturing Port Moresby, a city off the coast of New Guinea near the Coral Sea. This information led to the not-so-famous Battle of the Coral Sea. The first naval battle between the aircraft carriers. This was a new kind of sea battle because the aircraft carriers never laid eyes on each other. They scoured the Coral Sea looking for each other and launching bomber planes to patrol the skies. The United States launched its big, heavy F-4F Wildcat fighter planes, and Japan launched its nimble Mitsubishi fighters. In the end, both sides suffered great losses. Some historians label the event a draw, a tie. Others claim the United States was victorious. Regardless, the Battle of the Coral Sea was now going to help shape the next big event in the Pacific, which was the Battle of Midway. You might have heard of the battle because it was one of the most important naval battles of World War II and is often a subject of historical discussion. The heavy fighting of the Battle of Midway came as a surprise to the Japanese. The Japanese planned on attacking the Aleutian Islands, miles away from Midway, to lure American troops away from their important post at Midway. U.S. forces had been stationed at Midway for years. The idea was a good one. The Japanese should have been able to take Midway, but only a skeleton crew protecting it. But unknown to the Japanese, the United States had once again broken Japanese secret code and learned ahead of time what they were planning. So rather than flee Midway to protect the Aleutians, the Americans waited in hiding to defend Midway while the Japanese sped right toward them. On June 4th, 1942, the Japanese were shocked to discover 3 fully equipped U.S. aircraft carriers near Midway, holding dive bombers, torpedo planes, and armed fighter planes. These ships were named the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown. The Yorktown was nicknamed Waltzing Matilda. The Japanese thought the Yorktown had been sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea, and so were very surprised to find Waltzing Matilda repaired and in battle. The Japanese had 4 equally loaded aircraft carriers named the Akagi, the Hairu, the Kaga, and the Soryu. But between heavy cloud coverage and mistaken identities, planes on both sides struggled to hit their targets. After hours of fighting in uncoordinated, piecemeal fashion, the Japanese seemed to be coming out ahead. However, American persistence paid off, and in a very short time, the tables turned that day in June. While the Japanese were rearming their torpedo planes with bombs, U.S. bombers nailed their targets right and left. In at least one case, elevators used to bring the planes up to the flight deck of the Japanese carrier were destroyed, preventing Japanese planes from taking off. And since at that time the Japanese planes below deck were fueled, fire was everywhere. Fighting continued through June 7th, but in the end, all 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were lost, along with 1 heavy cruiser, 3,500 men, and 300 planes. In comparison, the United States lost only the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, and 307 men. The United States had clearly won this one. At Midway, the United States nearly destroyed the entire Japanese fleet that had been involved in bombing Pearl Harbor. Naturally, most Americans were proud of that fact, and Midway would later prove to be a turning point in the war in the Pacific. The Japanese were humiliated by their losses at Midway and chose not to report them back home. Now, there's 3 quick stories to share of how the United States responded to Japanese aggression and the war that followed. The first story deals with the American family. As 11 million men went to war against the Axis powers, things changed at home. Women joined the workforce in droves to maintain the production of goods and services, especially war materials. Rosie the Riveter, a muscular-looking housewife, became a popular icon for the nation, promoting sacrifice and hard work. Food was rationed in America as well as Europe to help feed soldiers, and families worldwide were encouraged to recycle tin, glass, rubber, paper, scrap metal, and fats left over from cooking. These items were salvaged for the troops. Americans were also encouraged to raise their own produce by building victory gardens on apartment roofs and in backyards, vacant lots, and city parks. The public complied, and nearly 50% of all vegetables consumed during World War II were homegrown. The second story about Americans responding to war is somewhat lesser known. While millions of men went to war on behalf of the United States, 25,000 women signed up as paramilitary pilots. Under the WASP, WASP, Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASP unit, it was formed in 1943. Only 1,074 women made the final cut and earned their wings. 2 were Chinese Americans, and 1 was a Sioux Indian. Though not trained for combat, these female pilots covered 60 million miles to ferry, tow, and test all types of military aircraft around the United States. Their primary mission was to free up more male pilots for frontline fighting. Though the WASP unit was dissolved in 1944 and not officially even recognized until 1977, 38 WASP pilots lost their lives while in service to their country. The third story about Americans responding to World War II is a difficult story, and it remains a sensitive topic. By an executive order of President Roosevelt, the United States rounded up 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry on the west coast of the United States and relocated them to 10 war camps. 2/3 of these people were U.S. citizens, and half were children. Internees were forced, without trial or personal interview, to leave their homes, jobs, and schools with only the belongings they could collect in a few minutes and carry. Pets had to be left behind. Were these concentration camps like the Nazis? No. Were they prison camps like the gulags? No. But they were confinement camps set up in the style of military barracks with armed guards, barbed wire fencing, and little to no privacy. In captivity, Japanese Americans were stripped of their civil rights, and many were coerced to give up their citizenship in the United States. Unsure of Japanese American loyalties during a war with Japan, the United States responded cautiously but harshly to the Japanese in its own borders, many of whom would later fight against their homeland as soldiers or translators on the side of the United States. Just so you know, internees were freed after the war, and most received some kind of financial compensation, but it would be 1971 before many Japanese Americans were given back their citizenship to the United States. The government issued a formal letter of apology to internees in 1990. Should you choose to study this further, Japanese American internment is a compelling story that most Americans know very little about. Some German Americans and Italian Americans were also incarcerated during the war, but their treatment was far less harsh. The Battle of Stalingrad. Getting back to the European theater of war, just 10 days after the Battle of Midway, the Eastern Front erupted into the deadliest battle of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. It's been a while since we looked at the war between Russia and Germany, so let's quickly review. Stalin and Hitler started off as friends and allies. Stalin believed he was one of 4 great powers entitled to rule the world: Russia, Germany, Italy, and Japan. Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Hirohito. What a plan these guys had. But, as you know, Hitler betrayed Stalin and with a great amount of nerve invaded Russia on June 22, 1941. Russia was many times bigger than the size of Germany, and it makes you wonder, what was Hitler thinking? The betrayal was called Operation Barbarossa. The Nazis first swept through the Soviet Union with their Einsatzgruppen units, ruthlessly executing more than 1 million Jews. Then, in blitzkrieg style, they pushed in 3 directions: toward Leningrad, Moscow, and various cities in the Ukraine. But Hitler changed his mind a few times on which targets were of highest priority. And so the Nazi army experienced several setbacks. Then, as you may recall, nature intervened. The bitterly cold winter of 1941 left the Nazis frozen in place, just 21 miles from the Kremlin. It was also just about that time that the Japanese decided to attack Pearl Harbor. Looking again at the Soviet Union, the Russians desperately held on to the city of Moscow through the winter, of 1941. Hitler could not be soothed and would not accept defeat. During the spring of 1942, he changed his strategy again. This time he directed nearly all his troops to the oil fields of Ukraine and put his favorite general, Friedrich Paulus, in charge. Those oil fields were extremely valuable to the Germans. Had Hitler stayed on course to obtain just the oil fields, the Germans might have had a shot at taking the Soviet Union. But, as might be predicted, Hitler's personal ego got in the way, and he decided not only to take the oil fields, but also to capture the city of Stalingrad. That is, Stalin's city. Did Hitler need to add insult to injury and capture the namesake of the Man of Steel? Not necessarily, but he tried anyway. Stalingrad became Hitler's new obsession. Remember, Hitler thrived on fanfare. He loved a large rally with bugles, drums, and parades. Taking Stalingrad and riding through its streets must have been Hitler's greatest daydreams, because he diverted many troops from the Ukrainian oil fields and pushed them on to take Stalingrad. Hitler's generals were beside themselves from being asked to accomplish the impossible. Already spent and exhausted, and with the Russian winter setting in, they could not take both Stalingrad and the Ukrainian oil fields. Paulus pleaded with Hitler for more provisions for the 6th Army in his charge. It was denied. Hitler wrote instead, "Surrender is forbidden. 6th Army will hold their positions to the last man in the last round, and by their heroic endurance will make an unforgettable contribution to the establishment of a defensive front and the salvation of the Western world." The Battle of Stalingrad that followed was beyond costly and more than horrific. It was as brutal as war gets. Soldiers and civilians died by the tens of thousands in Stalingrad from everything that kills in a winter war: cold, disease, starvation, infection, and fatal wounds. Temperatures dropped to as low as minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. The Germans called it a rat's war for having to fight through the filth of vermin and the ruins of bombed-out streets. The Russians, at least, had the advantage of fighting for their city from their city. They recruited men, women, and children to defend their homeland. Hitler underestimated again the human resolve of the Soviet people and the abilities of Soviet General Georgy Zhukov. Still, at least 1.1 million Soviets and about 245,000 Germans lost their lives in battle or in prison because Hitler thought he had to have Stalin's city. He never got it. The Soviets remember their fallen with one of the world's largest and most majestic statues, called the Motherland Calls. General Zhukov and the Soviets received help from the troops on hold in Siberia, who were armed with flamethrowers and ice gliders, while more and more Soviet T-34 tanks came off the assembly line. Friedrich Paulus, the German general, saw his defeat coming. He disobeyed the Führer and surrendered to the Soviets on January 31st, 1943. Ironically, Paulus surrendered one day after being promoted by Hitler to field marshal. The day of Paulus's surrender was a bad day to be in Hitler's presence. He asked Paulus to consider committing suicide, since no Nazi field marshal had ever surrendered. Paulus refused and would later turn against the Führer and the Nazis. The Invasion of Normandy, otherwise known as D-Day. For 2 years, Allied forces plotted and planned the most effective way to break Hitler's stranglehold over Europe. Hitler boasted that the Third Reich would rule 1,000 years. The Nazis were just a few years into that dream when the Allies decided to invade the beaches of Normandy, which is in France. They decided to invade with everything they had. The entire invasion, which took weeks, was codenamed Operation Overlord. The heart of the surge into Normandy, June 6, 1944, was nicknamed D-Day. The D stands only for day. It's a military slang for secret day. Why did the Allies choose Normandy? Well, both the Germans and the Allies knew of two logical places to invade France. Those two places being the coastal region of Normandy and the city of Calais. Both were just across from the English Channel from Great Britain. What Germans and the Allies didn't know was how to read each other's mind and predict each other's moves. One was sure to try to trick the other. This is exactly what happened with the invasion of Normandy. The Allies placed General Bataan in charge of a phantom army at Calais to steal the attention of the Nazis. Furthermore, Bataan was demoted to this position of commanding the phantom army because he slapped a soldier recovering in the hospital. It was a costly overreaction by Bataan. The Allied plan to deceive Hitler worked. Hitler put his strongest troops at Calais to keep an eye on Bataan. Ironically, the Germans placed Pataan's old rival, Rommel, the Desert Fox, in charge of Normandy, just in case the Germans guessed wrong, and Normandy fell under attack. This was, of course, before Rommel was accused of treason. General Bataan wasn't excited to be running the decoy operation at Calais because he much preferred the front line of battle. He believed it was his destiny. Rommel wasn't excited about guarding Normandy because he too preferred the front line of battle and expected the action to take place at Calais. Nonetheless, being a good soldier, Rommel did as much as he could to fortify Normandy with mines, trenches, barbed wire, and concrete bunkers. Knowing this, can you imagine how Rommel and Hitler felt when they heard that Normandy was under attack rather than Calais? Hitler was asleep when the invasion started, and his own men were too afraid of his anger to wake him up. The deception at Calais had been successful. Here are a few things the Allies did behind the scenes to pull off the surprise attack at Normandy. 1. While the Germans were scrambling from British air raids over Berlin with newly deployed P-51 Mustang fighters, the Allies sneaked across the English Channel to obtain samples of the sand on the beaches of Normandy. Those samples helped determine the best places to land. 2. The Allies built an underwater pipeline from England to Normandy to pump 1 million gallons of fuel across the English Channel. That was a brilliant feat. 3. The Allies dressed dolls up like soldiers and dropped these dummy paratroopers randomly across France to divert the Germans away from the beaches of Normandy. 4. Minesweepers cut through the English Channel to clear a secret path for Allied ships. 5. On the night before D-Day, 2 engine planes pulled silent gliders into France, jammed full with men and equipment. Once released, the gliders landed quietly, and their passenger soldiers proceeded to destroy strategic bridges. The invasion of Normandy was originally scheduled for June 5th, 1944. Bad weather postponed it a day. The weather was, in fact, so bad that it led Rommel to relax for a few days. Besides, June 6th was his wife's birthday, so he left his post for a short vacation at home. Meanwhile, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, head of the Allied command and later a U.S. president, sent the first wave of paratroopers into France in the dark, the early hours of June 6th. These pathfinders were to mark drop zones for the 13,000 paratroopers coming in the next wave. Unfortunately, only 40 out of 120 pathfinders hit their targets, meaning that the second wave of paratroopers, soon to fall from the sky, would be landing blindly in the largest air assault in history. Mistakenly hitting the sea, deep swamps, and enemy territory, hundreds of second-wave paratroopers perished or were taken captive. D-Day did not start well. At 5 a.m., the situation looked more promising when 2 midget subs rose to the surface of the English Channel, undetected by the Germans. These tiny 5-man vessels, hidden underwater for days, successfully marked a crossing zone for ships using flashing green lights and yellow flags. And then it began. At 6:30 a.m., the largest amphibious invasion in history was launched. Eisenhower released 4,000 to 5,000 vessels to cross the choppy English Channel. The massive armada of battleships, cruisers, frigates, and destroyers was a shocking sight to see if you were a German soldier on the shores of Normandy. The Allies used code names for their 5 planned landing spots at Normandy. They were Gold, Juno, Omaha, Sword, and Utah. It's difficult to adequately describe the D-Day landings because while some troops landed with little resistance, others were killed on the spot. Americans of the 29th Division who landed at Omaha Beach saw the worst situation and suffered the loss of about 3,000. Clumsy tanks rolling off cargo ships and onto the beaches sometimes missed their marks and sank to the ocean floor. Seasick men staggered in the surf, drowning under the weight of their packs. Barbed wire fencing trapped men left and right. Mines exploded every few feet. Artillery showered down on all. There was air coverage, but Allied planes could hardly fire on Germans without hitting some of their own men. One brave soldier said at Omaha, "There are only 2 kinds of men on this beach, those who are already dead and those who are about to die. Now let's go inland and die." Despite the gruesome scene at Omaha and the fact that some troops missed their landings altogether, new waves of soldiers continued to arrive and unload at Normandy. While some built an elaborate portable harbor, others fought their way tooth and claw to secure rocky cliffs several hundred yards away. At the cost of about 5,000 men, no one knows the exact count, 155,000 Allied soldiers secured the Normandy beachhead by nightfall and began their difficult move inland to retake France. Normandy would be a turning point on the European side of World War II and the beginning of the end for Hitler, although Hitler would deny that his final chapter was coming. By taking Normandy, 3 million Allied troops were poised and positioned for a full but difficult assault against the Third Reich. In the next lesson, we'll see how the Germans responded to the invasion with one more deadly rally and how Hitler ultimately handled the collapse of his empire.